Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something that requires a very careful approach. The material is, well, it's incredibly complex, historically heavy, and it demands, I think, a really profound degree of analytical rigor.
It absolutely does. And it's important to be clear right from the start about what we're doing. We are undertaking a deep dive into the source material associated with, yes, one of history's most notorious political documents, Mein Kampf.
Or, and this is key, as it appears in some of our source artifacts, MINHA LUTA.
Yes, and that's the core of this exercise, isn't it? It's a unique and I think a really challenging deep dive because we are explicitly not analyzing the ideology inside the text. We can't.
Right, we don't have it.
The sources you've provided, they consist entirely of the outside.
Right.
The packaging, we have the textual identifiers, the title, the author, and then this very powerful collection of visual artifacts.
The cover art, the really striking color palettes, the photography, and even logistical data like barcodes.
Exactly. It's the show of the thing.
That's a great way to put it. Our focus today is a kind of forensic analysis of that packaging. If you think of this book not as a text but as a product, a political product designed for mass consumption and ideological spread, then what we're doing is an audit of its branding. Mm-hmm. We want to understand the profound intentionality behind the visual identity, the shell, the typography, the symbolism, and how this framing really defined the document's impact long, long before anyone would have even read the first page.
It's an exploration of influence by proxy, you could say. Can the weight, the intent, and even the historical trajectory of a document be understood just by looking at its peripherals?
It's a fascinating question.
The cover is the architecture of the message.
Right.
And we are, for the next little while, going to be dissecting that architecture piece by piece.
Our mission is to analyze these highly charged artifacts, the symbols, the typefaces, the sheer visual rhetoric, to understand the document's identity and its initial framing, how it was presented to the world.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's jump right in. Section 1. The very first point of contact for any potential reader, the title and the author.
Right. And the titles we see across these sources, they immediately give us a fundamental insight into the document's intent and its scope. We see the title in German, Mein Kampf, and we see the translation, MINHA LUTA.
My struggle.
My struggle, exactly. The literal translation is straightforward. But the dual presentation in German and then in Portuguese, that's immediately critical.
It really is, that multilingual aspect, just the very existence of MINHA LUTA. It instantly signals something huge. It tells you this document was never, ever intended to be confined to just a German national context.
Not at all. It implies an expectation or maybe a very intentional push toward global distribution, global impact. It's right there in the title.
Yeah.
You're transforming a national manifesto into a kind of transnational blueprint. A blueprint, yeah. If we only had the German title, our analysis might be a little more limited. We'd focus on the specifics of, say, the post-World War I Weimar Republic.
Sure, the political chaos of that specific time and place.
But the translation, and specifically into Portuguese, that's the language of global commerce, a bridge to enormous territories outside of Europe, especially South America. It forces you to acknowledge this was branded for international consumption from very early on.
The packaging itself, right there on the title card, it tells us the ambition was world-spanning. Even if the ideology was, nationally specific, the brand was claiming a kind of universal relevance.
And let's focus on the words themselves, the core concept, Mein Kampf. You said this earlier, it's not titled A Proposal for Germany or a New Political System. It's My Struggle. That pronoun, my, is.
Right.
It feels immediately manipulative.
Oh, it's a masterful piece of rhetorical framing. Yeah. It really is. The title casts the entire political project as the heroic, almost inevitable culmination of one single man's personal existential battles.
It merges the personal and the political completely.
It transforms individual grievance into a universal guiding destiny for an entire nation. Your struggle is now our struggle.
And we really have to stop for a moment on the weight of that German word, Kampf. It gets translated as struggle, but in post-WWI Germany, that word carried an immense cultural weight.
That's a crucial point. It implies something far more dramatic than just an argument or a difficulty. Kampf denotes a highly dramatic, often martial almost an existential combat.
A fight to death.
In a sense, yes. It suggests heroic effort, a fundamental conflict, a decisive battle. It's very different from, say, a word like Auseinandersetzung, which is more like a debate or a dispute.
Or strike, a quarrel.
Exactly. By choosing Kampf, the author immediately elevates his narrative from a simple policy discussion to a kind of heroic epic, a singular life-or-death battle for survival and ultimately for victory. The reader is being invited into a war, not a political debate.
And by attaching the mind to this epic concept, it personalizes that heroism. It makes the author the one and only protagonist in this grand national drama. It's the ultimate narrative leverage.
It is. It demands that the reader approaches the document not as a set of policies to be argued over,
Right.
but as a narrative of sacred history that's being revealed to them.
And that framing is just essential for understanding how the book was received at first. The title sets the entire tone before you've read a single word. It frames the whole political platform as an autobiography of overcoming.
And that personal victory narrative is designed very specifically to compel empathy, loyalty, and a belief in the author's almost mythical fitness to lead the nation out of its own struggle.
So this whole analysis of the dual title, and especially seeing MINHA LUTA, it brings up that critical question you hinted at. Does using a translated title actually change how that initial concept of the struggle is perceived by readers who are outside of that original German context?
I absolutely believe it does. The translation, in Portuguese or any other language, it potentially simplifies and universalizes the concept of the struggle.
How so?
Well, the very specific, immediate historical context of Weimar Germany, the Treaty of Versailles, hyperinflation, the internal political street fights, all those details that are embedded in the German understanding of Kampf, they get a little softened in translation.
Ah, okay.
The more universal idea of my fight or my personal battle against a corrupt system, that takes precedence.
Yeah.
It becomes more abstract, more applicable to anyone's situation.
So it makes the ideology more adaptable, easier for audiences dealing with their own, non-German national grievances or a sense of societal decay.
Precisely. The translation transforms a document that was about national recovery for one country into a template for almost any revolutionary movement anywhere. It effectively helps it morph from a manifesto into a universal myth.
That shift is, wow, it's incredibly revealing about the global ambitions that were baked into the packaging from the start.
So, moving from the title itself, we arrive at the author, Adolf Hitler. The name is clearly, unambiguously identified across every artifact we have.
And that clarity is just fundamental, isn't it? It asserts that this text is explicitly an autobiographical and political manifesto. It's coming from one singular central figure. There's no suggestion of a committee or a collective. It's the definitive word from the man himself.
And understanding that explicit authorship is completely inseparable from the document's historical impact. I mean, when a political work is signed so emphatically by the leader of a movement, especially a revolutionary one,
it's not just a book anymore.
It ceases to be mere literature. It becomes doctrine. It becomes policy. It becomes prophecy. And it's all validated by the authority of the one individual who supposedly lived the struggle.
And this emphasis on the individual, it's immediately connected to the visual sources. We don't just see the name in print. We see a photo, an accompanying black and white photograph of the author. And that photo, it acts as this immediate, powerful piece of visual evidence. It ties the name explicitly to the man, and it reinforces that whole biographical element implied by the title, My Struggle.
It's a key piece of political branding.
Yeah.
It provides an immediate sense of authenticity and gravity to this personal account. It visually affirms, look, this is the man whose life story is the struggle you're about to read. And look at him. He's determined. He's serious.
So we've established the naming, the personal framing, and this dual ambition, the personal story combined with a global reach. Now, let's pivot completely to the visual field. This is section 2, where we decode the primary visual language of these artifacts, the really powerful dominance of red, black, and white.
Yes.
This is where the intensity just hits you like a physical force.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The visual sources are instantly striking. You can't ignore them. We see this stunningly stark, incredibly consistent theme. A deep, vibrant red coupled with these heavy, stark black shapes. And then white is used very selectively for the title or for other key text.
And this isn't just arbitrary design, is it? This is a highly calculated, psychologically charged exercise in political branding.
Not arbitrary at all. Every choice is deliberate.
So let's start with the red. Let's analyze the dominant red. Historically, especially in the early 20th century, red it's an explosive color.
It's the color of extremes,
Yeah.
of high intensity. It signifies revolution, it signifies blood, intense passion, and often it's a color of political warning or danger. But in the specific context of Weimar Germany, using a deep, vibrant red like this, It carried specific risks, but also specific rewards.
The risks being its association with the left.
Exactly. The left, the socialists, the communists, they had a very strong claim on the color red as their primary visual identity. You saw it on all their flags and banners.
So by choosing a dominant red for these covers, the National Socialists were performing a kind of tactical visual co-option. They were stealing the aesthetic of their enemies.
They were. They were claiming the mantle of revolutionary change. They were trying to harness that working class energy, stealing the kinetic charge associated with the color right from their political rivals. It's a very aggressive visual move.
The sheer volume of red on these covers, it's overwhelming. It's signaling this intense ideological fervor, a demand for radical revolutionary change. But it's a revolutionary energy that's immediately harnessed by the second dominant color, black.
Yes, and the black is used for the silhouettes, the shadows, often the author's name. And visually, black carries the weight of gravity, of authority, of power, and this imposing, almost monolithic presence.
So if the red is the fire,
If red is the passion and the revolutionary fervor, then black is the discipline. It's the traditional authority and the absolute power that controls and directs that passion. In German tradition, black was often associated with, say, Prussian militarism, with conservative power structures.
so by fusing this revolutionary red with an authoritarian black, the packaging visually represents a kind of synthetic, aggressive new ideology. It's one that offers both radical change and rigid, unyielding order.
You've hit it exactly. It's a very sophisticated visual solution to a complex political problem. It communicates that this struggle, this Kampf, is both dynamic and absolutely controlled.
It's not just fiery rhetoric in a book, it's a system of imposed authority that's built on top of that revolutionary zeal.
And then you have the white. It's deployed so strategically. It's for the title MINHA LUTA, and it acts as the ultimate highlight. Against the dark, intense background, white provides this stark contrast. It ensures that the central concept, the struggle itself, just pops. It stands out amidst this storm of revolutionary and authoritarian colors.
Like a spotlight.
It is. It's a spotlight, asserting that the guiding principle through all this chaos is the author's singular heroic path.
So this fusion of red and black, it visually represents the aggressive, high-stakes nature of the struggle. The cover art is just so communicative. It's loudly broadcasting conflict, seriousness, and a total rejection of subtlety.
And that's why it's effective. It's uncompromising, it's instantly memorable, it achieves a powerful and immediately recognizable brand identity.
You could even connect this specific color, triad red, black, and white, to the historical failure of the Weimar Republic's official colors.
Black, red, and gold, yes.
Those colors were seen by many on the radical right as weak, associated with a failing liberal democracy.
They were. So by using a deep, intense red paired with this heavy black and stark white, the document immediately, visually, declares its aggressive opposition to the established order. It's presenting itself as a more powerful, more distilled, more potent alternative.
So let's go deeper now into the abstract visual analysis.
Yeah.
Section 2.2, the shapes and silhouettes, because these are arguably the most emotionally charged parts of the covers.
I agree. We see these highly blurred, jagged, and very strongly vertical black silhouettes against that red background. They're dynamic, they're energetic, but they retain this sharp verticality. There's an almost a distorted human shape suggested in some of them, isn't there? A figure looming large, or maybe even figures like a crowd surging forward.
It's ambiguous, which is part of its power.
I find myself interpreting these blurry, dynamic shapes as representing the chaotic, formative energy of that early struggle that's detailed in the biographical parts of the book. It's the individual, the author, being violently forged by political turmoil and hardship. They're unstable shapes, yet they exert this powerful upward force. And the jagged edges are absolutely key to that message. In visual analysis, sharp, non-organic edges, they denote conflict, severity, resistance. These are not smooth, comforting, organic forms. They are cuts. They're spikes, they're aggressive distortions, and that aligns perfectly with the aggressive name of the book, Kampf.
And the verticality you mentioned, that's crucial. These forms, they seem to rise up and just dominate that red field. They emphasize ascent, hierarchy, ambition.
Yes.
So the struggle isn't just depicted as some internal conflict. It's a monumental rise to power, visualized by these imposing vertical lines of black asserting their dominance over the red field of revolutionary fervor.
But then our sources introduce another very different visual motif. It's the vertical alternating black and white bars. This stark, repeating linear pattern. It's completely different from the jagged, organic-looking silhouettes. It introduces a moment of of cold, mechanical precision.
Yes, that's a great observation. They resemble so many things. They could be barcode imagery, which we'll get to. They could be rigid architectural supports, or more ominously, maybe prison bars.
And this shift in the visual rhetoric is huge. It moves from dynamic passion to this very ordered, rationalized control.
The interpretation there seems essential for understanding the transition that the book is promising, from chaos to a system.
I think so. First, that clean, simple vertical structure suggests a rigid ideological scaffolding, hierarchy, unwavering order. These are absolute lines. They define space, and they impose structure. They signify the disciplined organization that is promised to arise from the chaotic struggle.
And if we take that other interpretation of prison bars or structures of confinement, that symbolizes control, the imposition of a singular will.
Right. It confirms that the movement is not about liberal freedom, but about the control and the disciplined unification of the national body, all under the doctrine that's laid out in the manifesto.
So it's a visual narrative in itself. The cover literally moves you from the raw, passionate chaos of the jagged silhouettes, the my struggle of the individual, to the cold, unyielding structure of the vertical bars. That's the imposed authority of movement.
The cover art is telling the story of transformation, visually, before the reader absorbs a single word of the text.
And before we move on from the pure visual identity, we have to talk about the typography. This is another element of the packaging that delivers a huge ideological weight. The font used for the title and the author, it's heavy, it's bold, almost block-like in some versions, and in others, it uses those traditional black letter styles.
That stylistic decision is so deliberate. If the cover uses a heavy, traditional German black-letter font, what people often call Fraktur or Gothic script,
Right.
it's signaling a very deliberate connection to national heritage, to tradition. It's a rejection of modern internationalist typography. It's an appeal to a kind of romanticized historical German past.
But if they opt for a cleaner, bolder, more imposing block font, like a sans serif or a very heavy Roman style, what does that signal?
That signals something different. It signals authority and modernity. It suggests this is a new, imposing, technologically streamlined power structure.
Yeah.
But what is consistent across the various artifacts, no matter the specific font, is the sheer weight of the typography.
They feel heavy.
The letters themselves are heavy and demanding. They occupy a significant amount of space on the page. They aren't light or airy or passive. The typography itself contributes to that feeling of gravity and authority established by the black color palette. The title is designed to be shouted, not whispered.
So the entire visual language, from color to shape to the typeface, it's all working together. It's a highly complex system that evolves from personal, fiery passion to this disciplined, authoritative structure. The cover is performing the ideology visually. It's ensuring the reader is emotionally and intellectually predisposed before they even open the book.
Perfectly summarized.
Okay, that deep dive into the visual rhetoric. It brings us right to Section 3. This is where we analyze the document not as a text, but as a mass-produced, market-ready artifact. And this is where the inclusion of a barcode image in our source material becomes so deeply insightful.
The barcode. It's the ultimate symbol of commercial efficiency and mass market reality. It provides a standardized, unique identifier that streamlines an object for commercial sale, for inventory management, and for mass distribution across a really complex logistical network.
It creates this fascinating and, frankly, kind of jarring tension. We're looking at a document that's positioned as this quasi-sacred text of a revolutionary movement, a text about destroying existing systems, and yet it's packaged with the most utilitarian symbol of modern industrial capitalism, the Universal Product Code.
The implications for distribution are just enormous. The barcode tells us that the text's goal was never to remain some niche political tract for a few believers. The objective was mass multiplication, standardized market distribution.
It really contrasts the high-stakes, spiritualized political content with the mundane reality that, to achieve scale, the ideology had to be processed and distributed like any other mass commodity, like a can of soup.
And that implies a crucial understanding by the text's publishers. Even the most radical, anti-establishment, world-changing ideology, it still has to conform to the structures of modern consumerism and logistics if it wants to achieve mass penetration.
The ideology had to be packaged for maximum commercial efficiency.
Now, consider the logistical complexity implied by that Portuguese translation we talked about earlier, and then combine it with a barcode. To distribute MINHA LUTA across Portugal or Brazil or other global markets, that requires navigating international freight, customs, diverse retail environments. The barcode is the technological key that unlocks that globalization. It standardizes radicalization.
That raises a really powerful contemporary question, one that spans across all modern political movements. What does the presence of a commercial artifact, like a barcode on an ideological manifesto, really imply about the necessary relationship between a political message and mass market consumption, even today?
It implies that market forces are almost never separable from political influence. To become a mass movement, you have to master the mechanics of logistics, of branding, of inventory control, everything that the barcode represents.
So we're forced to see the political message in this context fundamentally as a product. The cover is the packaging, designed to be handled, sold, and multiplied as quickly as possible.
You could almost argue that the barcode is the most modern and in some ways the most unsettling piece of propaganda on the cover.
How do you mean?
It strips away all the romantic heroism of the struggle and it replaces it with the cold efficiency of the assembly line. It connects the abstract idea of ideological control with the very real organizational structure required to manage a modern political movement. It's the difference between just having fiery rhetoric and having the ability to organize millions of followers and distribute millions of books.
Okay, let's transition now to the human element that's embedded in this artifact structure. The photographic image provided in the sources, the black and white close-up of Adolf Hitler.
This photograph serves a primary, essential rhetorical function. It takes all that abstract, aggressive ideology that's implied by the colors and the jagged shapes, and it grounds it directly in a person. The concepts become concrete. They become manifestations of this one man's singular will and his experience.
And the photographic style itself seems highly deliberate. It's a close-up. It forces the reader to engage with his expression. He's typically shown in formal, wear a suit, a high-collared jacket, which reinforces the image of an established, serious leader, not a street agitator, even if the text itself is chronicling his early agitator days.
Yes, and the lighting and composition of photos like these generally convey seriousness, determination, focus. This visual presentation validates the text as an authentic record of this specific figure's transformation from his individual struggle to becoming a public leader. It's an image of aspirational power. It links the struggle of the past, which is the text's content, to the authority of the present, which is the cover photo.
Why black and white, though? Against this highly chromatic red and black background, why not a color photo?
Well, color photography was not common for mass market books at the time. But even if it were, the black and white choice is critical. It lends a timeless sense of documentary gravity. It immediately frames the author and his struggle as historical, even at the moment of publication.
Like you're looking at a monument already.
Precisely. It suggests permanence and seriousness. It demands that the reader view this figure with immense respect and authority, transcending the colorful, chaotic political moment of the day.
And this image, it also acts as a kind of authoritative signature, doesn't it? The persona of the author is often the most powerful tool for mobilizing an audience. The photo transforms what could be an anonymous author-reader relationship into a direct, almost intimidating encounter with the leader.
The author is not just a writer. He is a force demanding your belief.
So the structure of the book as an artifact, therefore, is this masterful synthesis of contradictory elements. You've got revolutionary zeal from the color red,
Bureaucratic organization from the barcode.
and the undeniable authoritative presence of the charismatic leader in the photo. It's an object designed not merely to be read or consumed, but to command.
It's an entire system of persuasion before you've even opened it.
We've now completed our analysis of the shell, the titles, the colors, the codes, and the image. So in Section 4, let's step back and consider the profound implications of studying a document purely through its peripheral elements, especially the insights we've gained from the absence of the core text itself.
This is, I think, the deepest point of our deep dive, the absence of the text. It forces us to recognize that a text's identity often completely precedes its actual content.
Yeah.
For most people, interacting with a document of this historical notoriety, it involves encountering his packaging, the title, the author's name, the visual branding, long before they would ever read a single word, if they ever do.
That's so true. The title, the aggressive colors, and the author's image, they're often all that is required to invoke the entire history and ideology associated with the book. We don't need a nuanced argument from page 300 to understand the book's cultural and political weight. The cover design, with its red field and that authoritative black silhouette, has already communicated that weight instantly.
The visual artifact becomes a form of concentrated, rapid communication. It functions like a logo or an insignia. When you see that red field, the black shape, and the title Mein Kampf, You instantly invoke an entire ideological framework, regardless of your personal familiarity with the content of the book's two parts.
The packaging is the shortcut. It's the shortcut to the shared cultural memory of the text.
And this speaks volumes about how influence works in the modern era. Influence relies on instant recognition, on an emotional charge, on simplified symbolism, often far more than it relies on nuanced textual arguments. The cover, in this context, is the purest form of political branding.
So it's important now to connect these observations to contemporary life. But we have to be very careful to focus strictly on the mechanisms of influence and messaging. We are analyzing the technique of ideological branding, not the ideology itself.
Absolutely, the technique.
So let's use an analogy. How do we compare the book's visual rhetoric, the stark colors, the rigid lines, the insistence on a singular heroic identity, to modern political branding or communication on, say, fast-paced platforms like social media?
The central takeaway, I think, is the imperative for immediacy and emotional resonance. The red, black, and white design we analyzed, with its high contrast and its simplicity, is functionally equivalent to a highly optimized digital thumbnail or a viral political meme today.
Ah, that's a great comparison.
The message must be instantly recognizable and emotionally charged to penetrate a mass consciousness that is just completely overwhelmed with data. Subtlety gets lost in the noise.
So the source visuals, they demonstrate a fundamental, almost prophetic understanding of propaganda through graphic identity. They understood that complexity loses impact. The entire platform was distilled down to 3 colors and one determined face. That seems to be the fundamental playbook for successful mass communication in any era.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When we analyze contemporary political movements, and it doesn't matter what their ideology is, we see these principles recycled constantly.
Me an example.
The use of simplified, high-contrast imagery. The emphasis on the singular, authentic leader whose personal struggle is leveraged for credibility. And the standardization of the message so it can be mass-produced and marketed, just like a product with a barcode. The same patterns appear over and over.
And what about the verticality we discussed earlier? The strong lines of authority and assent in the silhouettes.
That visual language is mirrored today everywhere. In the architecture of modern political logos, in the structure of certain viral video segments, in the curated, idealized images of leaders that are meant to convey unwavering strength.
So these artifacts, they show that effective ideological dissemination requires packaging that overcomes intellectual resistance through sheer visual force and simplification.
We have to acknowledge the intellectual demand of this exercise. We are studying the marketing strategy of a notorious ideology. And it reminds us that every movement, whether historical or current, is deeply reliant on skilled graphic design and distribution logistics to manage its perception and to scale its ideas. The book cover is the very first piece of public architecture built to support the entire structure of the ideology.
The key insight for me remains the power of that standardization. The barcode confirms that the ambition was not just revolutionary, it was industrial. It demanded that revolutionary concepts be packaged and distributed with the same cold, rational efficiency as any other consumer good.
And that allows the message to bypass traditional critical gatekeepers. If the packaging is compelling enough and the logistics are efficient enough, the message spreads before deep ideological vetting can even occur. The cover is the promise that hooks the consumer. The content comes later, if at all.
Okay, let's bring all this together. A summary of the key takeaways from our analysis of these very charged sources. We've established the strategic value of the dual language title to signify global reach, and the deliberate choice of my struggle to frame the ideology as this personal, heroic, existential journey. And, of course, the absolute necessity of the author's portrait to provide a singular source of biographical authority.
And critically, we dissected the aesthetic. The aggressive symbolism of the red and the black, which visually communicates revolutionary passion contained by an imposing authority.
Right. We analyzed the jagged silhouettes as the energy of chaos and the vertical bars and the barcodes as symbols of rigid structure, order, and mass market distribution. And we also noted how the sheer weight of the typography demanded attention and seriousness.
So the final conclusion from studying these artifacts is that the identity of this notorious document was established through a masterful blend of graphic design, psychological priming, and strategic mass market planning. The cover was designed to be unmistakable, emotionally overwhelming, and unforgettable. It achieved influence through visual shock and thematic simplification.
So what does this all mean?
I think it means our investigation into the peripherals, the packaging, the code, the colors, the typography, has been exceptionally revealing about the mechanisms of political influence. We learned that the context of distribution and the skill of the visual branding are often just as telling as the content inside.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to carry forward. Given the profound impact these external elements clearly had on historical events, flipping the narrative before a single word was ever read is the study of how powerful or controversial documents are published, distributed, and framed. You know, the covers, the titles, the barcodes. Is that study just as important as the study of the words inside in truly understanding their ultimate cultural and historical impact?
The container often defines what is contained, especially in a world where messaging and mass production intersect. Thank you for trusting us with this deep dive into the artifacts of influence.
We really appreciate you engaging with this complex material. Until next time, keep digging into the sources.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are undertaking what might be the most unusual and perhaps the most conceptually challenging deep dive we have ever attempted.
I think that's fair to say.
The source material you sent us is heavy, historically charged, and intellectually very complex. It's labeled as Excerpts from My Struggle Part 2. And we know that you, our listener, are seeking those key insights into the development, the structure, and the core arguments of the original text.
That is the goal. However, and this is a big however, we have to start by establishing a very clear analytical boundary here. Our mission is to analyze the stack of sources exactly as you provided them.
And this is where it gets strange.
It is. In a highly unusual twist, this material isn't traditional legible text. It's not something we can read. Instead, what we have is a series of highly fragmented, high-contrast visual images.
Right, they're just abstract patterns of black and white.
Exactly. So our entire analysis has to be about that form.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this framing, it fundamentally shifts how we have to approach the next hour. We are, and I mean this literally, staring at a collection of intensely zoomed in, blurred black and white snapshots. If you were with us looking at the source material, you would see nothing but streaks, maybe some semicircular arches, and these absolute unforgiving shadows.
It's visually very stark.
So our deep dive today is entirely into the, let's call it the architecture of obscured knowledge. We're asking, why did the source material arrive in this abstract visual form? And more importantly, what can we learn just from these persistent structural artifacts?
And that raises the most important question for our work today. How do we apply rigorous conceptual analysis when the actual content is completely hidden?
Right. Our usual tools are gone.
They are. The traditional analysis of historical context, chronology, or specific themes it's just impossible. We're forced to focus solely on the formal elements of the presentation. The sheer intensity of the contrast, the consistent pattern of fragmentation we see, the inherent visual textures, and, the implied meaning these characteristics suggest about the nature of the underlying content.
So it's a purely didactic exercise.
It has to be. A didactic exercise in visual rigor. We are dissecting the container, its limitations, and the noise it produces, not the content it may or may not hold.
I find that approach fascinating.
Yeah.
Genuinely.
Yeah.
We are analyzing the flaws in the mirror, not the image it fails to reflect.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's move straight into what we can truly decode purely from the visual language of these fragments.
Let's do it.
The first, most commanding characteristic across every single image fragment is the overwhelming absolute presence of high contrast.
It's the first thing you see.
It is strictly black and white. This duality is immediate and it's unavoidable. You have these deep absolute shadows bordering on a visual void. The blackness is almost physically heavy.
It has weight.
It does. And it's set immediately against these blinding, sharp white lines and shapes that look almost laser-etched onto the darkness.
And if we pivot that idea, that observation, into a conceptual one, that formal element of absolute contrast is so vital. Think of it as a forced visual choice. It doesn't matter if it's intentional or just an artifact of how it was copied.
The result is the same.
The result is the same. The overwhelming absence of gray areas, the lack of gradients, the complete removal of any subtle shades, it suggests a deeply, almost aggressively binary framework.
A binary framework.
Yes. This visual quality, the form of the information, inherently rejects nuance. It rejects complexity. It rejects compromise. It presents a world of stark, uncompromising opposition.
Light versus dark, good versus bad. Correct versus incorrect?
Precisely. There is no in-between.
It's visually aggressive in its refusal to include complexity. It's like looking at an extreme photocopy of an older document, where the setting has been cranked to maximum density.
That's a perfect analogy.
All the data that provides context, at the middle ground, it's completely pulverized. It's lost. So what does it mean when the form we are given inherently rejects the very concept of a middle ground?
It creates a state of profound conceptual rigidity. When all information is visually presented as either an absolute affirmation, that blinding white, or an absolute negation, that deep black, the capacity for critical assessment, for compromise, or for conditional belief, it just vanishes.
So the visual presentation is actually modeling an ideological structure.
It is. One of uncompromising, non-negotiable opposition. And for the observer, for you, it is intensely stressful. It demands an immediate commitment to one side or the other, simply because the visual field offers no restful intermediate space for your eye to land.
Wait a minute. So is this basically the visual equivalent of that logical fallacy, if you're not with us, you're against us?
Precisely. That's a brilliant connection. The visual field has already performed the logical reduction for you. The observer, the learner, is preconditioned by the very form of the source to accept only definitive, uncompromising statements.
Because that's all there is to see.
That's all there is. Furthermore, the intensity of this contrast, this technique we'd call high chiaroscuro in art, it doesn't just signify opposition. It signifies drama, emergency. It heightens the emotional stakes of whatever the underlying content might be, transforming the material from what could be a reasoned argument into a stark emotional imperative.
That's structural urgency. It's just so consistent across the entire stack of images. It never lets up.
Never.
And this, I think, leads us naturally to the second element we noticed, the blur and the implied movement. When you look closely at these fragments, you see this pervasive vertical, sometimes diagonal, streaking and blurring.
It's not a crisp, stable image of a page.
Not at all. It's volatile. It's in motion.
And what's so fascinating here is the implication of rapid action or instability. The source material isn't static. It feels like it was caught mid-motion.
Like it was captured quickly.
Maybe. Or perhaps under poor lighting, or printed under some kind of volatile conditions. In terms of conceptual rigor, this pervasive blur suggests an unstable or a rapidly evolving narrative, rather than a settled, reasoned, or a carefully curated academic argument. The lack of detail forces speed upon the viewer.
That's a really interesting point. The blur denies us the time necessary for critical synthesis.
Say more about that.
Well, if the image were sharp, if we could read the words, we could pore over the text, right? We could check references or dissect sentences. But the blur, it keeps the underlying information moving, it keeps it just out of reach. It prevents a focused, static analysis.
It demands a gut reaction.
Yes. It almost gives the content a sense of immediate, overwhelming urgency. Whatever this material is, the visual presentation just screams, act now, scrutinize later.
And the logical endpoint of that visual choice is the suppression of analytical thought. The blur acts as a functional screen. It ensures that the observer only registers the sharp emotional impact of the high contrast, while the complex, conditional data, it just remains illegible.
So it's a mechanism that privileges immediate, reactive acceptance over measured, rational digestion.
It is. And what's more, the streaking motion often disguises repetition. Because the image is blurred, our eyes focus on the trajectory of the streaks rather than the precise, possibly identical shapes underneath.
Which makes the content seem dynamic and evolving.
Exactly, even if the core message is completely static and just being repeated over and over again.
And that dynamic disguise brings us to the third fascinating element. The repetition of these obscured shapes. They seem to surface and then vanish right back into the noise across all the fragments.
Yes, there are these recurring geometric suggestions. I see rounded edges, almost semicircular forms that suggest arches or maybe the ends of banners or symbols.
I see that too.
And then you have these sharp, rigid, vertical or diagonal white shafts of light that seem to just slice through the blackness. The sheer consistency of these vague structures is really noteworthy.
These shapes feel like visual anchors trying to surface from the chaos. They provide just enough data for the viewer's recognition system to engage, to try and make sense of it.
Right.
I keep seeing the suggestion of a forceful, centralized curve, maybe the curve of a helmet or the architectural suggestion of a monument or an archway. But just as you think you see it, it's instantly swallowed and neutralized by the blur and the high contrast.
This leads to a truly profound line of questioning for our deep dive, doesn't it? It delves into the psychology of observer projection. The Rorschach effect.
Exactly what I was thinking. These shapes feel like Rorschach tests.
Is the meaning embedded in the shapes themselves, or is the meaning created entirely in the viewer's desperate, motivated attempt to impose recognition onto them?
What a question.
The fragments are visually designed to resist full, objective identification. They embody the conceptual idea that partial, obscured knowledge is inherently suggestive and often profoundly misleading.
Let's delve into that Rorschach analogy a bit more. In a traditional Rorschach test, the ambiguity of the inkblot forces the observer to project their internal states, their existing fears, their biases, their hopes onto the image to give it meaning.
Correct.
Here, the sources aren't just ambiguous. They are structurally ambiguous by design or by artifact. Doesn't this basically guarantee that the observer fills the gaps with their own pre-existing ideological framework?
Absolutely, 100%. The structural ambiguity acts as a kind of filtering mechanism. The source material is so abstracted that it can really only confirm beliefs that are already held, rather than challenging the observer to generate some new understanding.
So if I'm looking for aggression,
If you're predisposed to see aggression, you will interpret the sharp white shafts as spears or lightning bolts or some form of violence. If you're looking for institutional power or stability, you'll see the curved shapes as protective arches or foundational monuments.
the visual form ensures that the underlying content, whatever it is, just reinforces what you already think.
It reinforces pre-existing notions rather than generating critical inquiry. It's a closed loop.
So if the underlying text is an ideology, the visual form ensures that the audience must commit to the implied, high-contrast emotional shape of it, rather than demanding the full, clear, nuanced picture. That is a devastating lesson in how form can dictate belief.
It forces a manufactured recognition instead of a factual observation.
Wow.
And that manufactured recognition is amplified by the sheer volume of fragments. If you see the same ambiguous arch 20 times, even if you can't fully define it, your brain registers it as a crucial, consistent symbol. It builds a sense of legitimacy based purely on repetition and visual dissonance.
Okay, we've moved from just describing what we see to the conceptual structure. Now we need to look at how this formal fragmentation reflects broader themes of history, memory, and the dissemination of, well, rigid ideology.
I think the most immediate conceptual implication is the role of fragmentation as an active barrier to understanding.
A bear.
An active one. These sources consist of many small, distinct, non-contiguous images. None of the pieces, standing alone, provide enough context to reconstruct the full text, or even a single legible sentence.
Okay, let's unpack this metaphorically. Within the context of analyzing dense ideas, this is so relevant. When we approach complex history or deep ideologies, we are inevitably dealing with fragments. We get rumors, edited excerpts, competing accounts.
It's never the whole story.
Never. This visual set is a perfect rigid metaphor for that process. We look at fragment A, a vertical Y streak, and then fragment G, a rounded arch, and we desperately try to connect them, knowing the full narrative that links them is missing.
And crucially, the act of connecting them requires us, the observers, to invent the information that resides in the gaps. We are forced to bridge that unanalyzable space between the fragments, that silent, dark gulf.
And that's where the danger is.
That is the intellectual space where assumptions breed. The source material, by its very design, outsources the narrative construction to the observer, which in turn makes the observer complicit in creating the meaning.
This raises an important question, particularly for you, the learner, who's navigating today's information landscape. In a world saturated with data, is receiving less data, but highly contrasted, emotionally resonant data, more likely to lead to oversimplified or extreme conclusions?
I think the answer is almost certainly yes.
The sheer form of these sources encourages us to fill in the blanks with assumptions that match the intensity of the available fragments, which is always, always high contrast.
The form is priming us for extreme interpretations because the visual language only speaks in extremes. It is designed for maximum emotional response, not maximum intellectual rigor.
And the size matters too, right? The small size of the fragments.
Yes, the small size prevents any sense of scope. We can't tell if the underlying content is discussing a small regional matter or a sweeping global concept. Everything is presented in the same visual vacuum, giving small ideas the exact same visual weight as large ones.
Let's talk about the visual noise itself, that graininess. We see this often in the dark areas where the black isn't perfectly flat, but it has this murky, grainy texture. It almost looks like static on a poorly tuned radio. It suggests information is struggling to break through the darkness.
What's fascinating here is the sophisticated relationship between what is visible and what is invisible. The visible data are the sharp contrasts, the hard lines of opposition.
The easy stuff to see.
The easy stuff. But the potential for nuance, the complex data, it resides entirely in that murky texture, the noise or graininess you can see in the deep shadows.
So it's there.
It suggests that crucial defining information is technically present, but it is indecipherable. It's unavailable for concrete, reasoned analysis. It's like the static that you know contains the signal, but you just can't filter it out.
So the complex truth exists, but it's relegated to the shadow. It's only accessible as noise for anyone who just skims the high-contrast headlines.
Right.
It requires an entirely different set of tools and immense effort to even discern its existence.
Exactly. Let's use an analogy. Imagine the difference between viewing a detailed oil painting versus a harsh digital rendering.
Okay.
The oil painting has texture, it has layered brushstrokes, minute differences in shade, a depth that you can only appreciate up close. This is the messy, complex truth hidden in those greeny shadows.
Right.
The high contrast fragments, however, are the harsh digital rendering, flat, binary, simple. The visual structure implies that the crucial details, the subtleties, the contextual specifics, the nuanced complexities, they exist only in the shadow, unavailable for concrete analysis.
This conceptual rigor deepens when we realize the sources are teaching us about the willful choice of simplicity or complexity. The simple, dangerous dichotomy, the black and the white, is what is most accessible and immediately legible.
While the subtle, complex truth, the textured gray area, is rendered functionally invisible.
The ideology, if that is what we are abstractly analyzing, is structurally designed to prioritize emotional impact and sharp definition over exhaustive, nuanced detail.
And the fragmentation and the high contrast work together perfectly to ensure that what registers in the mind is absolute rather than provisional or conditional. The observer has to expend a disproportionate amount of energy to seek out and decode the complexity hidden in the visual noise,
making it highly unlikely that the simplicity of the black and white message will ever be undermined by subtle truth.
It's a very effective system.
Okay, so when analyzing a complex text, we typically look for intellectual development,
Right.
a narrative flow, or how core themes evolve. Since we don't have the text, we have to rigorously analyze whether the visual characteristics themselves change as we move through the sequence of fragments. We're looking for structural evidence of intellectual growth.
And the key structural finding here, which is, well, it's conceptually damning, is the absolute stagnation of form. Complete stagnation. The visual characteristics. The extreme blur, the punishing contrast, the recurring arches, the vertical slashes, they remain remarkably consistent across every single provided image. There's no shift in visual tone. There's no moment where the visual language softens, introduces a stable focus, or allows a single gradient of gray to exist.
So what does this all mean for the ideas contained within? Unlike a developing story where a character learns and changes, or an evolving intellectual argument that incorporates counter-evidence, these excerpts show no conceptual growth, no self-correction.
None.
We begin with extreme contrast, and we end with extreme contrast. It's a static, relentless visual environment.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, a consistent, unchanging visual style, even when it's obscured and abstract, suggests a rigid, unchanging worldview.
So the form reflects the content's nature.
It has to. The underlying argument, whatever its specific content, appears structurally dogmatic. It signals systemic closure. The ideas contained within refuse deviation, they refuse intellectual compromise. They refuse external influence. The form dictates the lack of intellectual evolution.
Let's discuss that concept of systemic closure in more detail. If we analyzed a philosophical text and found that the author's early chapters contradicted later chapters, we'd either assume, poor editing, or we'd note the author's intellectual growth over time.
A very common thing to find.
But in these fragments, because the form never evolves, it always maintains that binary opposition, the source is telling us that any potential internal contradictions are either suppressed or just made invisible by the sheer, unwavering rigidity of the structure.
And that's the danger of systemic closure. The material has established its binary, uncompromising rules, black versus white, and it refuses to break them. By denying the possibility of variation or deviation in the visual medium, it implies that the intellectual argument within is equally immutable and flawless within its own closed logic.
If the form never compromises, the content is intended to be seen as equally uncompromising.
Precisely.
That rigidity is then compounded by the sheer absence of anchor points. Because the visual data is so abstract, lacking any legible text or page numbers or chapter headings or any recognizable real-world objects, we can't anchor the source material. We can't pin it to a specific time or place or context.
Even if we were allowed to use external information, which we are not, we couldn't.
Right. There's nothing to grab onto.
And that absence is crucial because it forces the material to exist in a vacuum of abstraction. It denies us the ability to ground the abstract concepts in the messy reality of time and place. It forces the analysis to remain purely theoretical and isolated.
Which is a common characteristic of totalitarian or dogmatic thought.
It is. It attempts to float above the complexities and contradictions of real life. We know, based only on the label you were given, that we're looking at something historically significant, but the fragments themselves deny us entry into that necessary context.
It's like being given a map that is just a collection of sharp black and white lines floating in space, with no legend and no coordinates.
And an excellent metaphor.
We're told this is important, but the information provided makes it impossible to verify its importance or its applicability beyond the visual frame. We are left only with the emotional urgency of the form itself.
And this brings us directly to the didactic application for you, the learner. This entire exercise in frustrated structural analysis is, paradoxically, a powerful lesson.
How so?
When you approach dense, historically sensitive, or ideologically charged sources, recognizing what is missing, the context, the nuance, the stable frame, the anchor points, is often just as important as recognizing what is present.
So this is training.
This source material trains us to demand the gray area. It trains us to demand the full texture and to be suspicious when the text is missing or obscured.
It teaches us to question any information presented in an aggressively binary, out-of-context manner. The material forces us to demand the complexity, because without it, the high contrast is intellectually blinding and it promotes a singular, unyielding internal logic, regardless of the objective truth.
Exactly.
Now let's take the structural lessons we've learned from these visual fragments, the binary contrast, the rapid blurring, the deep fragmentation, and apply them to how we consume information in modern life. This is where the analysis gets really interesting for me.
It does.
Because the structure of these sources feels remarkably, almost uncomfortably familiar to the structure of contemporary communication.
If we zoom out for a second, we see these visual characteristics mirrored everywhere. Just think about these abstract sources in terms of how information hits us today.
Social media.
Social media, rapid-fire headline news, partisan political discourse. We are constantly fed information in the high-contrast black and white mode. There's very rarely complexity, just immediate, sharp opposition. Us versus them, right versus wrong.
The form is identical. The digital environment demands this structural simplicity because complexity slows down transmission. It slows down engagement.
And the blur.
The blur is the speed of the share button. It's the need to keep scrolling. The high contrast is the clickbait headline or the emotional political slogan. Both deny time for synthesis and demand an immediate, polarized reaction.
So we are absorbing the visual and structural form of dogmatism, even when the content itself varies wildly from one post to the next.
That's chilling thought.
Let's consider the fragmentation specifically. Use the example of social media character limits or short-form video. On platforms that limit length or demand brevity, every piece of information is functionally non-contiguous. You see a 30-second soundbite from a speech, then an emotionally charged opinion about it, then a rebuttal that uses a completely different set of facts, and then a meme all separated by the noise and the scroll.
And you're left with a series of distinct fragments. Your mind is forced to create the narrative bridge between them.
And as we established earlier in Section 2, the brain tends to use the most vivid, high-contrast pieces to do that bridging. It's much easier to accept the visually simple binary answer, the sharp white line, than to engage in the effort of seeking the grainy texture hidden in the shadows.
This raises a really important question. Does the constant bombardment of fragmented, high-contrast information functionally limit our capacity for critical synthesis?
I believe it does. We are being trained day in and day out to process information based on emotional intensity and visual simplicity. We're mimicking the structure of the obscured sources we analyzed.
And this lack of nuance creates an intellectual environment that's ripe for the same kind of dogmatic rigidity we identified in Section 3.
A systemic closure, where new information must conform to the established binary framework or be rejected.
Here's where we get practical. Think about the 24-hour news cycle, particularly political analysis. Often, commentators present only the sharp extremes of a complex issue, argument A versus argument B, with very little time dedicated to the intermediate factors, the mitigating circumstances, or the historical texture.
The need for constant hot takes demands high contrast and speed, the blur over intellectual stability and texture.
It's the same structure.
And what's fascinating here is the persistent need for critical thinking to question the very presentation of the information. When sources, whether they're visual fragments like these or contemporary headlines, are fragmented, incomplete, or presented with extreme emotional or visual contrast, the analysis must shift.
How should it shift?
We have to stop focusing only on what is being said, the surface-level argument, and start questioning how the material is forcing our perception and limiting our available conclusions.
So we're challenging the tyranny of the black and white. We have to learn to recognize that this abstract visual form, or its modern conceptual equivalent, is designed to bypass reasoning and grab emotion. And we must consciously resist that pull.
And the effort required to analyze these abstract sources versus simply accepting their binary nature, it mirrors the intellectual discipline needed today to move beyond simplified narratives.
That's a powerful point.
We spent all this time analyzing what is not there. The context, the stability, the nuance, and the conceptual lessons gained from that absence are immense. The source material you provided, despite its visual obscurity, functions as a masterclass in structural analysis and resistance to oversimplification.
It teaches us that when all you have are stark white lines cutting across deep black spaces, you have an outline, but you absolutely do not have the truth. The truth lives in the messy, blurry, grainy, textured parts that are harder to see.
The parts that require effort and time.
This has been a deeply challenging yet, I think, profoundly insightful journey into the architecture of obscured knowledge. We started with a pile of fragments labeled My Struggle Part 2, and we ended with a rigorous analysis of structural rigidity, high contrast, the purpose of blur, and the conceptual implications of fragmented sources on contemporary thought.
And the key insight, the thing we must carry forward, is that the power of a source doesn't just lie in its content, it lies deeply in its form. The rigid binary structure of the source material you provided, despite its visual obscurity, taught us a profound lesson about the nature of dogmatism and the binary temptation inherent in understanding any complex issue, whether it's historical or contemporary.
We analyzed the blur and the contrast, but we never broke through to the text itself.
And consider this. In your own daily research, when you're engaging with political statements or historical arguments or even a scientific claim, train yourself to spot these structural flaws. The next time you see a 3-word headline or a soundbite stripped of its context, ask yourself what gray texture is missing. What information are you being given in sharp black and white, and what are you allowing the visual or conceptual blur to hide? What happens when you intentionally move past the high contrast lines and seek out the texture hidden in the shadows, the nuance, the complexity, the missing coordinates? That is where true critical understanding begins.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive. This is the space where we take a look at complex, sometimes very difficult historical source material. We analyze its structure, its rhetoric, how it's all packaged, so that you can walk away not just informed, but, well, really aware of how these documents are engineered.
And today we are definitely undertaking a uniquely challenging piece of analysis. We're diving into the structural framework and the visual context for a document our sources just designate as MINHA LUTA, Mein Kampf 3.pdf.
Yeah, and given the historical gravity of this text, we have to maintain just absolute analytical rigor here.
We do.
That title alone, calling it the final part of such a notorious political text, it tells you right away that we're operating in a zone of extreme rhetorical intensity. So our mission here, and we need to be crystal clear about this for everyone listening, is strictly didactic. It's impartial. We are not engaging with, and we are absolutely not endorsing the ideology or the contents in any way, shape, or form.
Precisely. As analysts, our job is to dissect the mechanics. The mechanics of political communication, of mobilization. Our focus is almost forensic.
Forensic, I like that word for it.
Yeah. How is this worldview packaged for mass consumption? We're going to break down 2 core components. First, what are the structural implications of calling a foundational political document Part 3 the final part?
Okay.
And second, we need to get into the detailed visual rhetoric, the specific images that are provided alongside this textual culmination. How do those 2 things work together to create a message that feels authoritative and, well, definitive?
Okay, so let's unpack that source inventory then. What are we actually working with? We have that textual designation, Mein Kampf Part 3.
Yeah.
That right there signals the endpoint of a huge argument.
The conclusion, yeah.
But critically, we also have a series of, they're very detailed, high-resolution black and white images.
Yeah.
And these visuals, they consistently juxtapose one central disciplined figure, we assume it's the author, against this massive, highly detailed piece of historical architecture.
And that juxtaposition, that's the key. We really can't treat these images as if they're just like being, decorative.
Right, not just window dressing.
Not at all. They are integral components of how this document is presented. They function as these powerful nonverbal arguments that reinforce the gravity and the alleged historical necessity of the text they're accompanying. If the author chose to include these specific high-stakes visuals in the final volume, you have to assume they serve a very definitive rhetorical purpose.
A purpose we have to decode.
Exactly.
So moving into that core structure then, let's think about political writing in general. When an ideological manifesto is presented in, a series of volumes, calling something Part 3, and explicitly the final part, that carries enormous weight, doesn't it? Structurally and psychologically for the person reading it.
It's the architecture of persuasion, but built across time. Think about the narrative arc that's required for any successful foundational text, especially one that's aimed at mobilizing a movement. The earlier parts have to establish the context. So Part 1, for example, is traditionally sort of for exposition. It covers the author's formative years, their biographical struggle, the origins of their intellectual awakening, basically the why behind the ideology.
The backstory.
The backstory. Then Part 2 has to escalate that. It moves into the foundational philosophy, the detailed critique of the status quo, and the comprehensive intellectual articulation of the ideology itself.
So Part 1 is the personal journey, the who I am and how I got here. Part 2 is the theoretical framework, the here's what's wrong and here's my big idea.
Exactly.
So if those first two volumes have successfully, laid out the problem and the belief system, the justification, what structural necessity dictates the content and the tone of the ultimate volume of Part 3?
Part 3 absolutely must represent the pivot. It has to be the definitive shift from theory to an operational program.
Okay. From thinking to doing.
Precisely. The text can't just remain a work of intellectual introspection or historical critique anymore. It has to resolve all the preceding arguments into tangible action. The final part is where the intellectual struggle ends and the political program begins its transition into mandatory execution.
So it's no longer just an idea.
It's moving from intellectual justification to concrete, unavoidable directives.
It's like the rhetorical difference between a philosophical statement like, this is the ideal society we could build, and a direct command. This is the precise, mandatory series of steps we start taking tomorrow to build it. The structure itself demands that endpoint.
Absolutely. And structurally, this volume signals the culmination of the entire worldview that's been presented. Every theme, every grievance, every philosophical point that came before, it all has to resolve into a cohesive, unchallengeable doctrine.
And when a document is this long, you have to imagine the reader arriving at this final volume, expecting not just closure, but a synthesis that makes all the effort of reading the first two parts feel worthwhile. It's the ultimate payoff.
And that idea of payoff is so critical. By promising a definitive end, the author is leveraging a really powerful psychological tool, which is just the human desire for cognitive closure.
Right.
After you've invested 2 volumes of mental energy, you're now primed. You might even be desperate for the definitive answers that Part 3 promises to deliver.
So there's a kind of psychological engineering at play here.
It's central to its efficacy. Defining this volume as final implies that the struggle is reaching its decisive phase. It leverages the rhetorical power of inevitability.
Inevitability.
Yes. If the ideology in parts 1 and 2 is framed as historically necessary, as the only logical response to these perceived existential crises, then the conclusion in part 3 suggests that this destiny is now upon the movement. The debate is over. The time is now.
So this inherent structural demand for action, it allows the author to adopt a tone of ultimate destiny, rather than just offering one more political opinion among many.
Exactly.
It gives this air of a historical mandate to the action plan detailed inside, and it sort of bypasses any need for further deliberation.
It does more than that. It structurally elevates the text from being just a book into an implementation guide. We have to ask, how does this structural demand influence the consciousness of the reader?
What does it do to you when you're reading it?
It creates a strong sense of internal pressure. The reader is made to feel like they're reading a roadmap to history's inevitable conclusion, and that by turning these final pages, they are essentially being drafted into that inevitability.
But let's consider a counterpoint to that for a second. Is there a structural cost to labeling something Part 3 final? I mean, does that kind of absolute finality risk alienating people who might feel the ideology is too rigid, that it lacks room for evolution or, adaptation after the author's gone or circumstances change?
That's a fascinating and a really critical lens to apply. And you're right, while the initial audience, the core believers, they'll find that finality very affirming. But any text that declares itself definitive risks becoming a historical artifact rather than a living philosophy.
So it could become dated.
It could. However, for a mobilization text, which this is, the rhetorical gain of immediate action often outweighs the long-term cost of flexibility. The goal of Part 3 isn't intellectual longevity. The goal is operational necessity. It says, this is the perfect plan, and you must adhere to it now.
So it dictates the pace of engagement. It forces the reader to see any kind of deliberation, any hesitation, as a weakness or a delay in the face of destiny.
Yes.
It sounds like the greatest structural function of Part 3, then, is to transform deliberation into something like treason.
Yeah.
To elevate obedience to the highest virtue by tying these directives directly to that perceived historical imperative. The structure itself is a mechanism of mobilization.
Precisely. And this mandate for decisive action, this climax of argument, is often formally enforced through specific structural devices within Part 3 itself. You'd look for the pervasive use of mandatory language, the future tense detailing specific outcomes, and the enumeration of clear sequential directives.
So not suggestions.
No, these are commands. And they leverage the emotional high that was created by the preceding volumes. The structure ensures the reader understands the transition. The analysis is over. The work begins.
So we've established this textual mandate for action in Part 3. Now we have to move to the concrete rhetoric, the visuals. This is where that structural argument for necessity gets immediately reinforced by a visual argument for authority.
Yes.
And here's where it gets, I think, really interesting, because the source images give us this stark, undeniable visual framework. A single figure set against this overwhelming, complex, monumental architecture.
The visual framing is everything. I mean, political writing that's designed for mass mobilization. It rarely trusts the text alone, especially when it's trying to confer some kind of historical legitimacy. The images are a form of political branding.
Okay, branding.
Yeah. Let's start with the central figure, the individual who's presented as the driving force behind this final directive.
Okay, so describing the images, what we see is the figure. It's clearly the author, often presented in what looks like a heavy formal coat or some kind of specific uniform. The angle is frequently low, which is a standard technique in photography to emphasize stature, height, and dominance.
And focus on the attire, on his bearing. We can see a visible belt or a strap, which suggests a kind of prepared, organized, maybe even martial bearing.
It's a very stoic presentation.
It is. The figure is not dressed like a contemplative academic, musing on theory in his study. This is the visual representation of a disciplined, ready agent of action. The uniform symbolizes structure and organization, which are essential ingredients for any operational mandate that's going to be detailed in a final part.
The implication is immediate. It's that the authority of the text isn't just intellectual. It's vested in a person who is capable of enacting and enforcing the directives.
Right.
Basically saying the writer is also the commander.
Exactly. And that presentation is critical for the transition we were just talking about.
Okay.
If Part 3 is all about practical implementation, the image has to visually assure the reader that the person behind the text has the resolve, the discipline, and the authority needed to carry those plans through. This visual branding transforms the writer into the disciplined head of the struggle, the embodiment of the principles from Parts 1 and 2.
Okay, so now let's shift our gaze to the backdrop, this monumental architecture.
It is.
It's overwhelming. It's highly detailed. We're seeing intricate stone or brickwork, spires, multiple distinct levels, and this clear, unmistakable element, a high clock face on a towering structure.
And this is such a deliberate choice of historical iconography. The style is often high Gothic or similar monumental historical architecture that's deeply rooted in European tradition. We have to explore the symbolic weight of using this specific type of structure.
What's the message there?
It connects the movement not to temporary political promises, but to a vast, permanent historical legacy.
So it's an attempt to visually anchor a revolutionary political movement in an ancient, established past.
Precisely. When you photograph a figure next to a structure that has stood for centuries, a civic monument or a cathedral built of enduring stone representing regional or national heritage, you're not just using a nice backdrop. You are visually arguing that that figure and their ideology are the rightful, necessary inheritors of that entire past. The structure itself becomes a silent witness, testifying to the movement's legitimacy.
Let's dedicate a little time to the specifics of that architectural style. I mean, Gothic structures or even neoclassical structures used for civic buildings. They're built to dominate the landscape. They're built to defy time. They represent a kind of continuity and power that's far beyond the lifespan of any single person or political party.
They represent endurance, the craftsmanship that's so evident in the details, the complexity of the spires, the intricate stone facing. It speaks to generations of collective effort, skill, and commitment to a shared cultural identity. So by framing the leader against that backdrop, the political program is implicitly claiming continuity with this deep, skilled, and enduring national spirit.
So it tries to erase the idea that the movement is a radical temporary break.
Yes.
Instead, it frames it as a necessary reassertion of these ancient truths.
Exactly.
I wonder, doesn't using such old, complex architecture actually imply a weakness? Kind of suggests the movement lacks its own modern vision and have to borrow authority from the past?
Yeah.
A truly revolutionary text might choose a modern, forward-looking backdrop, something like a massive dam or a stark new industrial complex. Why rely on the past?
That is an excellent point and a really crucial piece of critical analysis. For texts aimed at radical mobilization, the reliance on historical symbols is often a mechanism of cognitive comfort.
Cognitive comfort.
Yeah. True revolutionaries often alienate the masses by demanding too much novelty. By using the Gothic monument, the text signals that the movement is safe, that it respects the past, even as it demands radical action for the future.
Ah, I see. It's a synthesis.
It is. It's radical action cloaked in traditional legitimacy. It leverages familiarity to ease the transition into revolutionary change. The monument acts as a kind of rhetorical reassurance against the volatility of the proposed program.
So the visual is designed to manage risk. It's telling the reader, yes, the Part 3 program is definitive and total, but look, it's sanctioned by history itself. The stone provides the necessary ballast to counter the urgency of the text.
Exactly. It attempts to make the decisive action feel inevitable because it's rooted in something immutable, something permanent. The complexity and the sheer scale of the stone structure suggest that the movement is dealing with matters of national, enduring importance, not just petty political squabbles. The visual scope elevates the stakes of the text to the level of eternal destiny.
Okay, so we've established the components. We have the figure representing discipline, singular authority. And we have the monument, representing enduring history and its complex collective legacy. Now for the crucial synthesis. What does the juxtaposition of that assertive individual against the overwhelming, complex historical structure? What does that communicate rhetorically to the reader of the final part?
The juxtaposition is the core visual argument of the document. The intricate structure, all the thousands of stones, the spires, the complex details, that represents the messy reality of the nation, its fragmented history, its collective past. The singular, disciplined figure provides the focal point of clarity and direction against that complexity.
So it's a visual argument for simplification and control. The chaotic complexity of the past or the present state of things requires a singular, unassailable guiding force to manage it all.
That is precisely the message. The image symbolically suggests that only the individual leader, the disciplined agent whose thoughts are filling the pages of Part 3, possesses the necessary resolve to capture and direct the vast, complex energy of the nation's heritage.
Wow. It establishes the individual as the singular vector of history, the necessary force to cut through the historical tangle and impose order. It's a profound visual argument against decentralized, pluralistic power.
I think we need to delve deeper into the psychological tension there, because the monument shows the collective weight of centuries, right? It required diverse effort, continuous maintenance, yet the figure stands alone, seemingly embodying all of that historical power. What does that do to the reader's perception of leadership versus the collective?
It creates a cognitive shortcut where leadership becomes synonymous with historical absorption. The reader is encouraged to see the complexity of history through the lens of the leader. The collective past is just too overwhelming to be understood by the average person, but the disciplined figure standing before it offers a simplified interpretation. a way for the reader to feel connected to the grandeur of the monument without having to actually understand the immense complexity of its real history.
So the leader acts as the sole essential translator of the national destiny.
That's the idea, yes. And then we bring in the clock. We noted that clear visual detail of the clock face high up on the monumental tower. In the context of a final part that's dedicated to immediate action, that element shifts the entire rhetorical equation.
That detail is arguably the most powerful piece of visual rhetoric in the entire presentation. If the monument represents eternal tradition, the clock face represents immediate ticking time. It represents a deadline.
It links the eternal with the immediate present.
It does. The message is no longer a passive statement of historical legitimacy, but a dynamic, urgent call to action.
The fusion of destiny and urgency. The message changes from "this plan is connected to history" to something more like "history is moving, the time on that clock is real, and the decisive action detailed in this final volume is now or never."
Absolutely. It injects a sense of temporal pressure into that eternal framework. The final part is thus presented as both a tradition rooted in the stone and a temporal mandate governed by the clock.
And that blend must be highly effective.
It is, because it satisfies the human need for both stability, we are permanent, and immediate mobilization, we must move. The clock warns the reader. Inaction is not just a political failure, it's a betrayal of the moment determined by fate.
This synthesis. It suggests the presentation is designed to override any critical pause the reader might take. Before they even read a single operational directive in Part 3, the visuals have already convinced them of two things: the authority of the source, which is the disciplined figure, and the urgency of the execution, which is the clock anchoring the eternal monument to this present moment.
That is the crucial insight. The visual evidence confirms that this final volume is not meant for intellectual contemplation. It is packaged as a definitive blueprint endorsed by historical inevitability, made urgent by the passage of time, and delivered by an embodiment of unwavering discipline. This prepares the reader to transition instantaneously from passive reading to active mobilization.
It's a preemptive psychological mandate.
Exactly. The packaging serves as exactly that.
You know, it's interesting how this visual rhetoric moves the document beyond just being text. How unusual is it in the history of foundational political treatises for the book itself, the medium that's supposed to convey rigorous thought, to rely so heavily on visual cues to establish authority, essentially using the image to validate the word?
It speaks to a profound understanding of mass communication and the limitations of purely intellectual appeal. While older philosophical texts often used abstract symbols or maybe minimal portraits, mobilization literature, which this final volume clearly aims to be, must simplify the complex intellectual history into immediate emotional and visual truths.
So this is a shortcut.
It's an acknowledgement that visual trust is often established faster and more forcefully than a textual argument. It really foreshadows the visual-heavy political communication that would come to dominate the 20th century. The sheer prominence and detail of this imagery suggests that for the Part 3 mandate to succeed, the image of the leader and the image of the nation's eternal identity must be inseparable.
So this analysis of the structure and the visual rhetoric of Mein Kampf Part 3, while we're strictly avoiding the content, it provides us with these invaluable lessons about the methods of political communication that seem to transcend any specific ideology. What can we, the informed reader, learn about the method of packaging authority that's still so effective today?
We learn that the tools of mobilization are, frankly, timeless. The sequential structure that leads to an inevitable conclusion, where theory becomes mandate, and the pairing of a disciplined leader with symbols of tradition and endurance. These are constantly recycled across the entire global political landscape. This packaging is a universal template for establishing unquestionable authority.
Let's focus on that pairing for a second. The singular disciplined leader, the figure, and the symbol of vast enduring tradition, the monument. You mentioned this addresses two fundamental human needs. How do we see that same mechanism replicated in contemporary contexts? Maybe in political branding or even corporate messaging?
Well, it addresses the simultaneous human needs for security and purpose. The monument, or its modern equivalent, whether that's a national flag, a historical seal, or even a classic corporate logo, it offers the security of connection to a permanent, trustworthy past.
Okay, the security.
And then the disciplined figure, or its modern counterpart, the CEO in the perfect suit, the politician with the unwavering gaze, that offers the purpose. The singular direction required to navigate complexity. When you fuse them, they create an image of legitimate authority. The leader is presented as merely the temporary steward of an eternal, essential project.
So for the discerning reader, for you, the listener, who wants to be critically aware, analyzing how these visual cues are used is the shield against manipulation. I mean, when does a grand historical backdrop truly elevate an argument, and when does it become a cognitive shortcut that just substitutes for substantive debate about policy?
That is the essential lesson of rhetorical analysis. Visual trust, especially when it's established through images of tradition and discipline, it often functions as a cognitive bypass. If the backdrop looks eternal and the figure looks unwavering, our inclination is to assign inherent authority and truthfulness to the words being spoken, often before we rigorously vet the policy details or the historical claims.
So the visual presentation becomes an instant validation.
Yes. And it can override the need for deep critical scrutiny.
And this structural demand for decisive action, the one that's inherent in the title Part 3, Final Part, is equally common in modern mobilizing literature, isn't it? It's just often wrapped in less historically charged language.
Absolutely. The rhetoric of necessity is ubiquitous. I mean, think of any contemporary movement that uses language like, if we don't act now, the opportunity is lost forever, or this is the last best chance, or the clock is ticking on our civilization.
You hear that all the time.
All the time. This framing, regardless of the subject, whether it's climate policy, economic reform, political campaigning, it's structurally designed to generate an artificial feeling of necessity. It shuts down procrastination and debate by framing deliberation as a luxury the movement simply cannot afford.
It turns analysis into opposition. If you question the plan in Part 3, you're not engaging in healthy debate. You are, by the structural logic of it, endangering the entire historical project that's rooted in that monument.
Precisely. The structure dictates that the time for analysis is structurally over and the time for mobilization is now. This is a crucial takeaway for understanding modern political communication. Pay attention not just to what is being said, but to how the message is packaged to look like the necessary, inevitable conclusion of history.
So you look for the deliberate combination of symbols of permanence and symbols of urgency.
That's where you'll find it.
We should also probably reflect on the structural cost of that simplicity. The disciplined figure standing against the monument simplifies all of history into a singular, manageable narrative. While that might help mobilization, doesn't it necessarily require the suppression of dissenting or complicated historical truths that just don't fit the narrative of inevitability?
Undeniably. The rhetorical power of the visual, the clean lines of the figure against the complex stone, is a deliberate act of historical editing. To create a definitive, final, operational mandate in Part 3, complexity is the enemy.
Right.
Therefore, the visual representation works to filter history. It highlights only the elements, like endurance and tradition, that support the current directive, while symbolically diminishing the elements, dissent, evolution, competing narratives that would challenge the leader's singular authority. The packaging is designed to present a history that is settled, final, and perfectly aligned with the current leadership.
And this brings us back to the psychological weight of the final part. When we consume any political argument today that's framed as the ultimate solution, the definitive end of debate, we have to ask ourselves if that framing is serving the truth of the situation, or if it's simply serving the authority of the speaker.
That critical questioning is the difference between being informed and being mobilized. The structural lesson here is that an appeal to destiny and urgency is one of the most powerful tools available to a political speaker. When the structural design, whether it's a 3-part series, a massive rally backdrop, or specific visual branding dictates that the time for thought is over and the time for implementation is now, your critical radar has to immediately go up.
The ultimate lesson, then, of analyzing Part 3's presentation is that the wrapping matters just as much as the content. The disciplined image and the eternal backdrop are meant to make the directives feel less like choices and more like fate.
That's the perfect way to put it.
So, this deep dive, focusing strictly on the forensic structural and visual rhetoric of Mein Kampf Part 3, has been, I think, profoundly instructive about the mechanics of mobilization and political communication.
We have established that the entire presentation is engineered for impact. The textual sequencing signals that inevitable transition from a theoretical argument to a definitive political program.
Right.
And this is ruthlessly reinforced by the strong symbolic imagery, the authoritative, disciplined figure set against the monumental, timekeeping backdrop, which merges historical continuity with immediate urgency.
The figure's martial bearing and the Gothic architecture, they provide this visual foundation of authority and permanence. And they work together to convince the reader that the movement is the necessary, decisive endpoint of history, which then demands immediate, unquestioning execution of the final directives.
It's a masterful study in rhetorical packaging. It's designed not merely to inform, but to convert passive readers into active agents by leveraging the psychological gravity of historical destiny combined with the temporal pressure exerted by that ticking clock. Understanding these powerful universal techniques is it's essential for navigating the contemporary landscape of complex information and pervasive political influence.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought to consider long after this deep dive is over. If the structural design of a political test, its sequencing, its title, and its accompanying images can carry such immense rhetorical weight and demand immediate, definitive action, what essential political ideas are we consuming today that are deliberately designed to look and feel like the final part of history? Are we still being sold blueprints disguised as destiny?